Topic 1.
La lengua como comunicación, lenguaje oral y lenguaje escrito. Factores que definen una situación comunicativa: emisor, receptor, funcionalidad y contexto.
Introduction. Traditional foreign language teaching concentrated on getting students consciously to learn items of language in isolation. These bits of information would be mainly used to read texts and only occasionally for oral communication. The focus was not on communication, but on a piece of language. Following Krashen's distinction between acquisitions and learning, we can say that people got to know about the language, learning, but could not use it in a real context, acquisition. The British applied linguist Allwright tried to bridge this dichotomy when he theorized that if the language teacher's management activities were directed exclusively at involving the learners in solving communication problems in the target language, then language learning would take care of itself. We may or may not agree with this extreme rendering of the communicative approach, but we all agree nowadays on the importance of letting our pupils use English for real communication during, at least, the production stage. In this unit we are going to study language and its functions to see that communication is one of these functions. We will then posit that learning a language is not only a grammatical and lexical process, but also a social process. We will also analyze the differences between writing and speech, and finally we will discuss the most important communication theory models, defining their key factors. It is important to establish the connection between our topic and the law. The Organic Law March 2020, of the 29th of December, which modifies the Organic Law February 2006 of the 3rd of May of Education, LOMLO, the Royal Decree 126/2014, which establishes the basic curriculum for primary education nationwide, and B. Curry, which establishes the basic curriculum for primary education in the autonomous community, indicate that among the general objectives of primary education is the acquisition of a basic communicative competence in a foreign language. Students will thus have to be able to understand and convey messages in a variety of daily life communicative situations, in both writing and speech. We are based on the aforementioned regulations, so that we adhere to the calendar for the implementation of LOMLO, set out in the fifth final provision of this law.
Language as communication. 1.1 Language definitions. We will start by providing different definitions of language to defend the idea that languages are means of communication, as the title of the topic affirms. The word language has prompted innumerable definitions. Some focus on the general concept of language, what we call a lingua or a language, and some focus on the more specific notion of a language, what we call a lingua or idioma. Sapir, 1921, said that language is a purely human and non-instinctive method of communicating ideas, emotions, and desires by means of voluntarily produced symbols. Traeger, 1949, said that a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which the members of a society interact, in terms of their total culture. Hall, 1964, defined language as the institution whereby humans communicate and interact with each other by means of habitually used oral auditory arbitrary symbols. As we can see in these definitions, it is difficult to make a precise and comprehensive statement about formal and functional universal properties of language, so some linguists have tried to identify the various properties that are thought to be its essential defining characteristics. What we can do, as part of an investigation of language, is concentrate on those properties which differentiate human language from all other forms of signaling, and which make it a unique type of communication system. A. Communicative versus informative. In order to describe those properties, we should first distinguish what are specifically communicative signals from those which may unintentionally be informative signals. A person listening to you may become informed about you via a number of signals which you have not intentionally sent. He may note that you have a cold, you sneezed, that you are not at ease, you shifted around in your seat, and that you are disorganized, non-matching socks. However, when you use language to tell this person, I would like to apply for the vacant position of senior brain surgeon at the hospital, you are normally considered to be intentionally communicating something. Displacement. When your pet cat comes home and stands at your feet calling meow, you are likely to understand this message as relating to that immediate time and place. Now, human language users are perfectly capable of producing messages equivalent to last night and going on to say. They can refer to past and future time, and to other locations. This property of human language is called displacement. It allows the users of language to speak about things and events not present in the immediate environment. Animal communication lacks this property. C. Arbitrariness. It is generally the case that there is no natural connection between a linguistic form and its meaning. The linguistic form has no natural or iconic relationship with the object out in the world. The forms of human language demonstrate a property called arbitrariness. They do not, in any way, fit the objects they denote. D. Productivity. It is a feature of all languages that novel utterances are continually being created. A child learning language is especially active in forming and producing utterances which he or she has never heard before. With adults, new situations arise or new objects have to be described, so the language users manipulate their linguistic resources or produce new expressions and new sentences. This property of human language has been termed productivity. E. Cultural transmission. The process whereby language is passed on from one generation to the next is described as cultural transmission. While it has been argued that humans are born with an innate predisposition to acquire language, it is clear that they are not born with the ability to produce utterances in a specific language. Cultural transmission of a specific language is crucial in the human acquisition process. F. Discreteness. The sounds used in language are meaningfully distinct. For example, the difference between a B sound and a P sound is not actually very great, but when these sounds are used in a language, they are used in such a way that the occurrence of one rather than the other is meaningful. This property of language is described as discreteness. Each sound in the language is treated as discrete. G. Other properties. These properties may be taken as the core features of human language. The use of the vocal auditory channel, for example, is certainly a feature of human speech. Human linguistic communication is typically generated via the vocal organs and perceived via the ear. Linguistic communication, however, can also be transmitted without sound, via writing or via the sign languages of the deaf. Similar points can be made about reciprocity. Any speaker/sender of a linguistic signal can also be a listener/receiver, or specialization. Linguistic signals do not normally serve any other type of purpose, such as breathing or feeding. (1.2) Language functions. After having studied the main properties of language, what is language, we will now see its functions. What is language for? In the simplest sense, the word of function can be thought of as a synonym for the word use, so that when we talk about functions of language, we may mean no more than the way people use their language, or their languages if they have more than one. Stated in the most general terms, people do different things with their language That is, they expect to achieve by talking and writing, and by listening and reading, a large number of different aims and different purposes. We could attempt to list and classify these in some way or other, and a number of scholars have attempted to do this, hoping to find some fairly general framework or scheme for classifying the purposes for which people use language. The Austrian psychologist Bühler, 1934, who was concerned with the functions of language from the standpoint not so much of the culture but of the individual. Bühler made the distinction into expressive language, conative language, and representational language. The expressive being language that is oriented towards the self, the speaker. The conative being language that is oriented towards the addressee, and the representational being language that is oriented towards the rest of reality, that is, anything other than speaker and addressee. However, one of the most widely known classifications of functions of language was proposed by Roman Jakobson in his article Linguistics and Poetics. Jakobson distinguished 6 functions that corresponded with the 6 factors involved in verbal communication: addressor, context, message, contact, code, and addressee. The first 3 are similar to the traditional model of language as elucidated particularly by Bühler: emotive, conative, and referential, but he adds 3 more. The following is Jakobson's taxonomy of language functions. 1. Referential, denotative or cognitive function is the leading task of numerous messages. However, the accessory participation of the other functions in such messages must be taken into account. 2. Emotive or expressive function aims at direct expression of the speaker's attitude toward what he or she is speaking about. It tends to produce an impression of a certain emotion, whether true or feigned. Swear words and obscenities are probably the most usual signals to be used in this way, especially when we are angry. But there are also many emotive utterances of a positive kind, such as expressions of fear, astonishment. 3. Conative function is directed to the addressee. It finds its purest grammatical expression in the vocative and imperative. 4. Emphatic function may be displayed by a profuse exchange of ritualized formulas, by entire dialogues with the mere purport of prolonging communication. It helps to establish or maintain contact between 2 speakers. If someone does not say hello to you when he is supposed to, you may think he or she is hostile. In these cases, the sole function of language is to maintain a comfortable relationship between people, to provide a means of avoiding an embarrassing situation. 5. A metalingual or meta-linguistic function refers to the use of language to speak about language itself. Any process of language learning, in particular child acquisition of the mother tongue, makes wide use of metalingual operations. The metalinguistic function is also predominant in questions like "Sorry, what did you say?" where the code is misunderstood and needs correction or clarification. 6. Poetic function focuses on the message for its own sake. Messages convey more than just the content. They always contain a creative touch of our own. These additions have no purpose other than to make the message nicer. Rhetorical figures, pitch or loudness are some aspects of the poetic function. Another function could be added, the performative function. A performative sentence is an utterance that performs an act. This use occurs in the naming of a ship at a launching ceremony. The act of naming the ship coincides in time with the act of launching her, or when a priest baptizes a child, equally. The child is baptized at the time the priest pronounces the words. 1.3 Communicative competence. Once the definition and the main functions of language have been presented, it may be appropriate here to develop the concept of communicative competence, which refers to individuals' ability to use language for effective communication in a variety of contexts. The communicative approach in foreign or second language teaching starts from a theory of language as communication. The goal of language teaching is to develop what Hymes referred to as communicative competence. Chomsky, 1957, defined language as a set of sentences, each finite in length and constructed out of a finite set of elements. An able speaker has a subconscious knowledge of the grammar rules of his language, which allows him to make sentences in that language. However, Hymes thought that Chomsky had missed out some very important information: the rules of use. A. Chomsky and the critique of behaviorism. Chomsky argued that it was impossible for people to acquire a language by simple repetition and reinforcement. Children, he said, do not learn a language this way, for they do not, in fact, repeat what adults say, but produce their own sentences, and create phrases which they have never heard before. They also make systematic errors, and no amount of correct input or of error correction will stop them from doing so. Children do not so much learn the grammar of a language, as they construct it anew. It should be said that even if this was the case for children learning their mother tongue, we could not simply assume that adults and adolescents learn FL in the same way. Nevertheless, the idea that overlearning of typical structures would lead to mastery of an FL seemed to be very dubious, in the light of Chomsky's critique of behaviorist approaches to language learning. However, Chomsky himself did not feel that linguistics could do much to help language teachers. Indeed, he wrote that neither linguistics nor psychology could do or say much to further the cause of classroom learning. To study language, then, we need to turn away from real usage, in which the actualization of grammar is always partial, interrupted and likely to be overridden by other concerns, and look to the prior knowledge of grammar that all speakers possess, and which has nothing to do with the social situation within which they happen to find themselves. From the start, this conception of the linguist's task aroused criticism, and one of the most telling critiques was made by the sociolinguist Hymes. Hymes and communicative competence. Hymes first of all draws attention to the image of the ideal speaker that Chomsky's model draws. The image is that of a child, born with the ability to master any language with almost miraculous ease and speed, a child who is not merely molded by conditioning and reinforcement, but who actively proceeds with the unconscious theoretical interpretation of the speech that comes its way, so that in a few years and with a finite experience, it is master of an infinite ability, that of producing and understanding in principle any and all grammatical sentences of language. The image, or theoretical perspective, expresses the essential equality in children just as human beings. It is noble in that it can inspire one with the belief that even the most dispiriting conditions can be transformed. It is an indispensable weapon against views that would explain the communicative differences among groups of children as inherent, perhaps racial. Hymes writes, the acquisition of such competency is of course fed by social experience, needs, and motives, and issues in action that is itself a renewed source of motives, needs, experience. We break irrevocably with the model that restricts the design of language to one face toward referential meaning, one toward sound, and that defines the organization of language as solely consisting of rules for linking the two. Hymes distinguished four aspects of communicative competence. A. Systematic potential. It means that the native speaker possesses a system that has a potential for creating a lot of language. Appropriacy. It means that the native speaker knows what language is appropriate in a given situation. C. Occurrence. It means that the native speaker knows how often something is said in the language and act accordingly. D. Feasibility. It means that the native speaker knows whether something is possible in the language. C. Canale and Swain's theory. One of the most helpful discussions of competence is to be found in Canale and Swain's 1980 article. They point out that there is some diversity of opinion in the literature as to whether or not the notion communicative competence includes that of agrammatical competence as one of its components, and 2. whether or not communicative competence should be distinguished from communicative performance. As they say, it is common to find the term communicative competence used to refer exclusively to knowledge or capability relating to the rules of language use, and the term grammatical or linguistic competence used to refer to the rules of grammar. As one component of their overall conception of communicative competence, they developed the interesting notion of strategic competence to deal with the knowledge and ability learners need to develop in order to take part in communicative interaction. D. Savignon's theory. The inevitable and fundamental changes in the nature of competence once it is associated with any kind of communication come out very clearly in Savignon's discussion of the subject. She makes such statements as the following: communicative competence is a dynamic rather than a static concept. It depends on the negotiation of meaning between two or more persons who share to some degree the same symbolic system. In this sense, then, communicative competence can be said to be an interpersonal rather than an intrapersonal trait. More consequences follow. Communicative competence is relative, not absolute, and depends on the cooperation of all the participants involved. It makes sense, then, to speak of degrees of communicative competence. The competence of native speakers, well developed though it may be, is relative. Mother tongue proficiency varies widely from child to child and from adult to adult. Vocabulary range, articulation, critical thinking, persuasiveness, and penmanship are but a few of the many facets of competence wherein native speakers differ. What is important is that there does not seem to be any awareness in any of these instances that a changed concept of competence is being used. Under these circumstances, it is very difficult to know in any given instance what exactly is meant by the term of competence. Savignon also posits that both sociolinguistic and strategic components may grant the language learner a basic, limited communicative ability before the acquisition of any grammatical competence. She finally suggests that strategic competence is present from the very beginning of language learning, diminishing in importance as the rest of the components increase. The concept of communicative competence is also present in our education system. The Organic Law March 2020 of December 29, which modifies the Organic Law February 2006 of May 3 of Education, LOMLO, highlights the importance of developing both oral and written skills in the 6 different years of primary education. All these contents aim to help primary students become communicative competent in the foreign language. The new Royal Decree 126/2014, passed on the February 28th, establishes the following blocks of contents for the area of foreign language in primary education. Block 1. Comprehension of oral texts. Block 2. Production of oral texts, expression and interaction. Block 3. Comprehension of written texts. Block 4. Production of written texts, expression and interaction. We are based on the aforementioned regulations, so that we adhere to the calendar for the implementation of LOMLO, set out in the 5th final provision of this law.
2. Spoken and written language. 2.1 Historical attitudes. Historically speaking, written language was considered to be superior to spoken language for many centuries. It was the medium of literature, and literature was considered a source of standards of linguistic excellence. Written records provide language with permanence and authority, and so the rules of grammar were illustrated exclusively from written texts. On the other hand, spoken language was ignored, when not condemned, as an object unworthy of study. Spoken language demonstrates such a lack of care and organization that cannot be studied scientifically. It was said to have no rules, and speakers have thought that, in order to speak properly, it was necessary to follow the correct norm. As this norm was based on written standards, it is clear that the prescriptive tradition rested on this supremacy of writing over speech. This viewpoint became widely criticized at the turn of our century. Leonard Bloomfield insisted that writing is not language, but merely a way of recording language by means of visible marks. This approach pointed out several factors, some of which we have already mentioned. Speech is many centuries older than writing. It develops naturally in children. Writing systems are mostly derivative, i.e., they are based on the sounds of speech. If speech is the primary medium of communication, it was also argued that it should be the main object of linguistic study. Actually, the majority of the languages of the world's cultures have never been written down, and this has nothing to do with their evolutionary degree. It is a fallacy to suppose that the languages of illiterate or so-called primitive peoples are less structured, less rich in vocabulary, and less efficient than the languages of literate civilization. Edward Sapir was one of the first linguists to attack the myth that primitive peoples spoke primitive languages. In one study he compared the grammatical equivalence of the sentence "He will give it to you" in 6 Amerindian languages. Among many fascinating features of these complex grammatical forms, note the level of abstraction introduced by the following example from Southern Paiute. Maya vania aka anga me equals give will visible thing visible creature thee. Many linguists and ethnographers, therefore, stressed the urgency of providing techniques for the analysis of spoken language, and because of this emphasis on the spoken language, it was now the turn of writing to fall into disrepute. Many linguists came to think of written language as a tool of secondary importance. Writing came to be excluded from the primary subject matter of linguistic science. Many grammarians presented an account of speech alone. Nowadays, there is no sense in the view that one medium of communication is intrinsically better. Writing cannot substitute speech. The functions of speech and writing are usually said to complement each other. We do not normally write to each other when we have the opportunity to speak, nor can we speak to each other at a distance. On the other hand, there are many functional parallels which seem to be increasing in modern society. We can now use recording devices to keep facts and communicate ideas, books for the blind, libraries for recorded sound, telephone answering machines, radio phone-in. On the other hand, writing is also taken the social or phatic function typically associated with the immediacy of speech. Birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, exam results, and many more are conveyed by means of cards. Despite these parallels, we can obviously find striking differences. 2.2 Spoken language. The most obvious aspect of language is speech. Speech is not essential to the definition of an infinitely productive communication system, such as is constituted by language. But in fact, speech is the universal material of human language. Man has almost certainly been a speaking animal from early in the emergence of Homo sapiens as a recognizably distinct species. The earliest known systems of writing go back perhaps some 5,000 years. This means that for many hundreds of thousands of years human language was transmitted and developed entirely as spoken means of communication. The description and classification of speech sounds is the main aim of phonetics. Sounds may be identified with reference to their production, their transmission, or their reception. These three activities occur at a physiological level, which implies the action of nerves and muscles. The motor nerves that link the speaker's brain with his speech mechanism activate the corresponding muscle. The movements of the tongue, lips, vocal folds, etc., constitute the articulatory stage of the speech chain, and the area of phonetics that deals with it is articulatory phonetics. The movement of the articulators produces disturbances in the air pressure called sound waves, which are physical manifestations. This is the acoustic stage of the chain, during which the sound waves travel towards the listener's ear. The study of speech sound waves corresponds to acoustic phonetics. These sound waves activate the listener's eardrum. The hearing process is the domain of auditory phonetics. Phonology is continually looking beneath the surface of speech to determine its underlying regularities. It is not interested in sounds, but in phonemes, i.e. smallest contrastive phonological units which can produce a difference in meaning. The study of speech is, therefore, the field of both phonetics and phonology. From a historical point of view, there is not a long tradition in the study of spoken language, since it was considered to be a secondary kind of language when confronted with the highly valued literary works. The fact that there was no permanent record of what people say in a conversation until the age of tape recorders made it be neglected in linguistic theory for many years. Mutability in the understanding and perception of what people say in a conversation is a natural fact for everybody. Arguments are typical situations in which people often blame each other for things which were or were not said and which were understood in the wrong way. A. Why did you say that? B. I didn't say it, what I said. A. What about your ironical tone? B. You don't understand what I mean. We seem to have a fine ear for the tone with which people say things to us, but a very bad memory for the actual things that people say. Firth was one of the first scholars who urged people to study conversation in 1935. In opposition to the current formalistic approach to language at the time, we must remember that one of the leading trends in that age was the mentalist approach led by Bloomfield. We shall find the key to a better understanding of what language is and how it works. The main concern of descriptive linguistics is to make statements of meaning, partly embodied in the levels of phonology and syntax, but language is mainly a way of behaving and making others behave. The linguist must concern himself with the verbal process in the context of situation. The tradition started by Firth and his followers, Halliday being the most representative one, has tried to show that speech is not a formless and featureless variety of written language, as it was thought to be. As a matter of fact, since then, there has been an increasing interest in the study of spoken language both from the purely linguistic point of view, e.g. the study of intonation, Halliday, Crystal, Cruttenden, etc., as well as from the social point of view, e.g. ethnomethodology, conversation analysis, discourse analysis, etc. A basic empirical finding about spoken language, one that has been discovered by conversation analysts and discourse analysts, is that spoken language consists of a sequence of exchanges that naturally develops out of a series of turns at talking. Sachs et al., 1974. In the light of this discovery, it is sequences and turn within sequences rather than isolated sentences or utterances that have become the primary unit of analysis. What emerges is that two distinct kinds of sequences may be alternatively considered as the most successful device for relating utterances: two utterance sequences, and longer than two utterance sequences. On the one hand, according to Shegloff and Sachs, 1973, utterances are related to form pair types, so that a particular first pair part sets up the expectation of a particular second pair part. So strong is the expectation that if the second pair part does not occur, its absence will be noticeable and noticed by participants. And when the expected response is not forthcoming, interlocutors often give an account of why it is not forthcoming. In other words, given a question, regularly enough an answer will follow. E.g., what time is it? It's 3 o'clock. On the other hand, Sinclair and Coulthard proposed a three-part exchange for analyzing spoken discourse, using classroom data as a starting point. Later studies such as Sui, 1994, and Garcia Gomez et al., 2002, have shown that spoken language develops naturally in three-part exchanges. This research has given rise to a fruitful methodology of investigation into the oldest form of human communication, mainly thanks to the help of audio and video recording devices, as well as to the development of computer databases which enable the researcher to accumulate a great deal of information which can be easily retrieved. (2.3) Written language. Myths and legends of the supernatural shroud the early history of writing. One point, at least, is fairly clear. It now seems most likely that writing systems evolved independently of each other at different times in several parts of the world in Mesopotamia, China. There is nothing to support a theory of common origin. We can classify writing systems into two types, non-phonological and phonological. Non-phonological systems do not show a clear relationship between the symbols and the sounds of the language. They include the pictographic, ideographic, cuneiform, and Egyptian hieroglyphic and logographic. A. Pictograms and ideograms. Cave drawings may serve to record some even, but they are not usually thought of as any type of specifically linguistic message. They are normally considered as part of a tradition of pictorial art. When some of the pictures came to represent particular images in a consistent way, we can begin to describe the product as a form of picture writing, or pictograms. Thus, a form such as might come to be used for the sun. An essential part of this use of a representative symbol is that everyone should use similar forms to convey roughly similar meaning. In time, this picture might take on a more fixed symbolic form, such as omicron, and come to be used for heat and daytime, as well as for sun. This type of symbol is considered to be part of a system of idea writing, or ideograms. The distinction between pictograms and ideograms are essentially a difference in the relationship between the symbol and the entity it represents. The more picture-like forms are pictograms, the more abstract, derived forms are ideograms. A key property of both pictograms and ideograms is that they do not represent words or sounds in a particular language. B. Logograms. When the relationship between the symbol and the entity or idea becomes sufficiently abstract, we can be more confident that the symbol is being used to represent words in a language. In Egyptian writing, the ideogram for water was. Much later, the derived symbol came to be used for the actual word meaning water. When symbols come to be used to represent words in a language, they are described as examples of word writing or logograms. A good example of logographic writing is that used by the Sumerians, in the southern part of modern Iraq, between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. Because of the particular shapes used in their symbols, these inscriptions are more generally described as cuneiform writing. The term cuneiform means wedge-shaped, and the inscriptions used by the Sumerians were produced by pressing a wedge-shaped implement into soft clay tablets, resulting in forms like. The form of this symbol really gives no clue to what type of entity is being referred to. The relationship between the written form and the object it represents has become arbitrary, and we have a clear example or word writing or logogram. Phonological systems do show a clear relationship between the symbols and the sounds of language. We can distinguish syllabic and alphabetic systems. A. Syllabic writing. When a writing system employs a set of symbols which represent spoken syllables, it is described as syllabic writing. There are no purely syllabic writing systems in use today, but modern Japanese has a large range of single symbols which represent spoken syllable and is consequently often described as having a partially syllabic writing system. Both the Egyptian and the Sumerian writing systems evolved to the point where some of the earlier logographic symbols were used to represent spoken syllables. However, the full use of syllabic writing system does not appear until that used by the Phoenicians. It is clear that many of the symbols which they used were taken from earlier Egyptian writing. B. Alphabetic writing. If you have a set of symbols being used to represent syllables beginning with, for example, a B sound or an M sound, then you are actually very close to a situation in which the symbols can be used to represent single sound type of sound. This is, in effect, the basis of alphabetic writing. An alphabet is essentially a set of written symbols which each represent a single type of sound. Thus, alphabetic writing establishes a direct correspondence between graphemes and phonemes. This makes it the most economic and adaptable of all the writing systems. In a perfectly regular system, there is one grapheme for each morpheme. However, most alphabets in present-day use fail to meet this criterion. At one extreme we find such languages as Spanish, which has a very regular system. At the other, we find such cases as English and Gaelic, where there is a marked tendency to irregularity. 2.4. Differences between writing and speech. Research has begun to investigate the nature and extent of the differences between them. Most obviously, they contrast in physical form. Speech uses phonic substance typically in the form of air pressure movements. Writing uses graphic substance, typically in the form of marks on a surface. Differences of structure and use are the product of radically different communicative situations. Crystal, 1987, pointed that speech is time-bound, dynamic, transient part of an interaction in which, typically, both participants are present and the speaker has a specific addressee in mind. Writing is space-bound, static, permanent, the result of a situation in which, typically, the producer is distant from the recipient and, often, may not even know who the recipient is. Holt-Graves, 2002, offers a complete inventory of what he calls mode features in terms of the grammatical, lexical and discourse features of speech and writing. A. Spoken mode features. 1. Grammatical features. The tendency to ellipsis. The abbreviation of verbs. The ability for phrases, particularly noun phrases, to stand for complete utterances. High incidence of coordinated clauses. The use of an as a loose continuation marker. Problematic clause analyses, and active verb forms. 2. Lexical features. Low lexical density. Tendency for less abstract vocabulary. Tendency for more generalized and simpler vocabulary and semantically empty prefabricated fillers. Use of terms that depend on the context of production for their understanding. 3. Discourse features. Discourse produced by more than one participant. High incidence of markers of interpersonal dynamics, repetition and echoing between speakers, indication of the presence of the author of the discourse. B. Written mode features. 1. Grammatical features. Full phrases and clauses with little abbreviation and less ellipsis, except in conjoining and listing. Standard grammar. longer and more complex clauses with embedded phrases and clauses, densely informative noun phrases, and explicit and varied marking of clause relations. 2. Lexical features, high lexical density, complex vocabulary, and the use of more abstract terms with a higher incidence of words of Greek and Latin origin, greater variety in choice of vocabulary with lower levels of repetition. 3. Discourse features, explicit presentation of idea to a non-presence audience, few markers of interpersonal or personally oriented discourse, explicit indication of text organization. Remember, written language was traditionally considered to be superior to spoken language for many centuries. Contrary to this influential view, a group of linguists and ethnographers argued in favor of studying speech as the primary medium of communication in the 20th century. Nowadays, there is no sense in the view that one medium of communication is intrinsically better. Writing cannot substitute for speech, nor speech for writing. The description and classification of speech sounds is the main aim of phonetics. In this sense, sounds may be identified with reference to the production, their transmission, or their reception, which in turn can be related to the three main fields of phonetics: articulatory, acoustic, and auditory. Two types of writing systems can be established: phonological and non-phonological. Holtgraves analyzed the differences between writing and speech by studying the grammatical, lexical, and discourse features of these two modes of communication.
Three, communication theory. 3.1 Communication definition. Communication, the exchange of meanings between individuals through a common system of symbols, concerned scholars since the time of ancient Greece. Savignon, 1997, 15, defines language and further emphasizes the contextual dimension of language use and that one's success in communicating may vary from situation to situation. Communication takes place in an infinite variety of situations, and success in a particular role depends on one's understanding of the context and on prior experience of a similar kind. Success requires making appropriate choices of register and style in terms of the situation and the other participants. Since about 1920, the growth and apparent influence of communications technology have attracted the attention of many specialists who have attempted to isolate communication as a specific facet of their particular interest. In the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan drew the threads of interest in the field of communication into a view that associated many contemporary psychological and sociological phenomena with the media employed in modern culture. McLuhan's idea, "the medium is the message," stimulated numerous filmmakers, photographers, and others who adopted McLuhan's view that contemporary society had moved from a print culture to a visual one. By the late 20th century, the main focus of interest in communication seemed to be drifting away from McLuhanism and to be centering upon 1. The mass communication industries. 2. Persuasive communication and the use of technology to influence dispositions. 3. Processes of interpersonal communication as mediators of information. 4. Dynamics of verbal and nonverbal, and perhaps extrasensory, communication between individuals. 5. Perception of different kinds of communications. 6. Uses of communication technology for social and artistic purposes, including education. 7. Development of relevant criticism for artistic endeavors employing modern communications technology. In short, a communication expert may be oriented to any number of disciplines in a field of inquiry that has, as yet, neither drawn for itself a conclusive roster of subject matter nor agreed upon specific methodologies of analysis. 3.2 Shannon and the Communication Theory. Fragmentation and problems of interdisciplinary outlook have generated a wide range of discussion concerning the ways in which communication occurs and the processes it entails. Most communication theorists admit that their main task is to answer the query originally posed by the US political scientist Harold D. Lasswell, who says what to whom with what effect. Obviously, all of the factors in this question may be interpreted differently by scholars and writers in different disciplines. In the late 1940s, Claude Shannon, a research mathematician at Bell Telephone Laboratories, invented a mathematical theory of communication that gave the first systematic framework in which to optimally design telephone systems. The main questions motivating this were how to design telephone systems to carry the maximum amount of information and how to correct for distortions on the lines. His groundbreaking approach introduced a simple abstraction of human communication, called the channel. Shannon's communication channel consisted of a sender, a source of information, a transmission medium, with noise and distortion, and a receiver, whose goal is to reconstruct the sender's messages. In order to quantitatively analyze transmission through the channel, he also introduced a measure of the amount of information in a message. To Shannon, the amount of information is a measure of surprise and is closely related to the chance of one of several messages being transmitted. For Shannon, a message is very informative if the chance of its occurrence is small. If, in contrast, a message is very predictable, then it has a small amount of information, one is not surprised to receive it. For some communication systems, the components are the following: information source, a man on the phone; transmitter, the mouthpiece; message and signal, the words the man speaks; channel, the electrical wires; receiver, the earpiece; destination, the listener. To complete his quantitative analysis of the communication channel, Shannon introduced the entropy rate, a quantity that measured a source's information production rate and also a measure of the information carrying capacity, called the communication channel capacity. He showed that if the entropy rate, the amount of information you wish to transmit, exceeds the channel capacity, and then there were unavoidable errors in the transmission. This is intuitive enough. What was truly surprising, though, is that he also showed that if the sender's entropy rate is below the channel capacity, then there is a way to encode the information so that it can be received without errors. This is true even if the channel distorts the message during transmission. What emerges from the general discussion above is another concept, first called noise source, but later related to the notion of entropy, which was imposed on the communication model. The notion of entropy diminishes the integrity of the message and distorts the message for the receiver. With regard to the notion of entropy, there are two mechanisms which are aimed at counteracting the potential failures in the communication process. On the one hand, negative entropy may occur in instances where incomplete or blurred messages are nevertheless received intact, either because of the ability of the receiver to fill in missing details or to recognize, despite distortion or paucity of information, both the intent and the content of the communication. On the other hand, redundancy also counteracts entropy. Redundancy can be defined as the repetition of elements within a message that prevents the failure of communication of information, is the greatest antidote for entropy. It is an indispensable element for effective communication. Shannon adapted his theory to analyze ordinary human, written, language. He showed that it is quite redundant, using more symbols and words than necessary to convey messages. Presumably, this redundancy is used by us to improve our ability to recognize messages reliably and to communicate different types of information. 3.3 Key Factors. Speech acts as Holtgraves, 2002, argues. In the early part of the last century there existed a major theoretical approach to language termed logical positivism that claimed all utterances were to be evaluated exclusively on the basis of their verifiability. In this view, if the truth of an utterance could not be determined, the utterance was viewed as meaningless. Austin's 1962 speech act theory arose from his observation that it simply is not possible to determine the truth value of many utterances. For example, the truth of the utterance "I promise to do it tonight" cannot be determined. The utterance has no relationship with the external world, and so truth conditions cannot be established. This led to Austin to propose a distinction between performative utterances and constative utterances. Constatives are utterances for which a truth value conceivably could be determined. Thus, one could ascertain the truth of the utterance, "It's raining out," by looking out the window. Performatives, example, "I apologize," on the other hand, are used in order to perform some act. Their occurrence changes the world in some way, and hence they are not amenable to a truth-conditional analysis. Although one cannot determine the truth value of performatives, there are various ways in which they can go wrong or infelicitous. For example, if you utter the performative "I declare war on Canada," you will fail to substantially alter the world. The remark will misfire, that is, it will have no effect because you have no authority to declare war. Performatives, then, are a class of utterances that are conventionally used as a means of performing certain actions. They can be either successful or not, but are neither true nor false. On the basis of these problems, Austin abandoned the performative-constative distinction in favor of a theory of illocutionary forces or speech acts. 4. Conclusion. Remember, communication has been defined as the exchange of meanings between individuals through a common system of symbols. Most communication theorists admit that their main task is to answer the query originally posed by Larswell, who says what to whom with what effect. Shannon's communication channel consisted of a sender, a source of information, a transmission medium, with noise and distortion, and a receiver, whose goal is to reconstruct the sender's messages. In speech act analysis, the effect of utterances on the behavior of speaker and hearer is studied using a threefold distinction: locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. According to Searle, 1969, there are 5 basic, primitive illocutionary points: directives, assertives, commissives, declaratives, and expressives. 2 types of context must also be taken into consideration: linguistic context and context of situation.